Hey guys, today I'll show you a supernatural horror TV series named RENEVANT AKGWI. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama takes place on a gloomy, rainy night when a man heard his mother's voice calling him from outside the door. Rushing to open it, he failed to notice the tentacled monster that suddenly appeared in the window behind him. Not long after, the man's corpse was found, a bizarre event that caught the attention of a man named Sang, who has had the ability to see spirits and ghosts since he was a child. He has been seeking and studying a supernatural dark force. One day, he saw a shadow skimming across the water's surface. He knew that the thing was back. He followed the shadow across a busy street and over a bridge. The shadow climbed up from the water onto the bridge pier, approaching a passerby, ultimately causing his death. At that exact moment, a woman named Young was on the bridge. Not long ago, she and her mother were scammed out of a large sum of money. Heartbroken and desperate, Young contemplated ending her life. As she leaned over the bridge, Young received a call informing her that the scammer had been caught, but the money had been squandered and was unrecoverable. Young and her mother were devastated. She wanted to go back to work and earn money, but Young knew that her mother always caused trouble when she worked. So Young convinced her mother to stay home and not to do anything. While they were talking, Young's mother received a phone call that made her saddened. She told Young that her father had died. This took Young by surprise because, as far as she could remember, her father had died in a car accident a long time ago. The mother and daughter went to the memorial hall to pay their respects. Young's father was a folklorist, known as Professor Gu. On a rainy night not long ago, he returned home and locked his door. He heard his mother outside the door calling him to open it, oblivious to the fact that the figure outside was not his mother, but a disheveled monster with waving tentacles. When Professor Gu opened the door, he saw a man who looked exactly like him, grinning eerily. By the time his real mother found Professor Gu, he was already dead. In the memorial hall, Young met her grandmother. The elderly woman called Young over, informing her that her father had passed on a particular heirloom to her. She handed Young a box containing an old-fashioned hairband. The moment Young touched it, strange images flashed in her mind. Upon seeing Young with the box, her mother immediately snatched it away and tossed it aside. Her mother deeply resented anything related to her father and grandmother, not permitting Young to touch anything in the house. She was repulsed by it all and was even unwilling to remember her deceased husband. The hairband fell on the floor. After the mother-daughter duo left, the grandmother picked it up again. As Young left, she ran into Sang, who had come to pay his respects. He was acquainted with Professor Gu and held a different perspective about the professor's death. It seemed like the professor had given up on life, but in reality, there was an unseen force at play. When Sang heard Young's mother calling her name, he realized that she was Professor Gu's daughter. He saw Young's shadow dancing wildly at that moment. Sang had many questions as he entered the memorial hall, but the grandmother, sensing he was not there to mourn Professor Gu, asked him to leave. Indeed, as she had suspected, Sang was investigating the death of Young's father, who had published many papers on the folklore of evil spirits, which were now the focus of Sang's research. After returning from the funeral, Young's life returned to normal. The only bad news was that the scammer had been released after being arrested, which was rather annoying. One day, while studying, Young dozed off at her desk. However, her reflection in the mirror stood up and left the room. Not long after, the scammer heard a knock on his door. When he cautiously asked who it was, a woman's voice answered. As soon as the scammer opened the door, Young's hand reached in and dragged him away. When Young woke up beside her desk, she found her computer screen was broken. On her phone, Sang had sent her several messages, asking her to contact him. But Young thought it was a telecom scam and paid no attention until she ran into Sang at an archaeological site during her part-time delivery job. Then, she realized the messages were indeed sent by Sang. However, she remained skeptical about everything he said, even suspecting it was a new form of scam. Sang claimed that Young was possessed by an evil spirit, and that everyone she despised would die because the spirit would grow stronger by satisfying a person's desires. He asked Young in detail about the places she had visited recently, or if she had touched anything suspicious, trying to figure out when and where she had been possessed. He also reminded Young to prepare a mirror, where she would see a different version of herself. In the evening, Young returned home to find detectives from the homicide squad waiting for her. She could only recall falling asleep at her desk that day. The police reviewed the surveillance footage from around Young's house and, indeed, she had been home as she claimed. But wherever the scammer had been, they found Young's fingerprints, which was truly puzzling. It's revealed that the scammer suddenly withdrew all his money that day, went to a tall building and threw it all away. Following this, he went to the rooftop, seemingly in despair, but there were marks on his wrists, as if someone had tightly gripped him, forcing him to act in such a way. Given the mysterious appearance of Young's fingerprints, it was hard to explain everything scientifically. A veteran detective named Detective Senior, who had seen many strange cases in his many years of service, began to believe in the existence of ghosts. He and Sang were old acquaintances. After the scammer's case occurred, he sought out Sang. Sang recalled the evil spirit that killed his mother years ago and was now possessing the daughter of Professor Gu. The detective advised Sang to let it go and pretend that the evil spirit didn't exist. The detective knew cryptic forces were at play in the world, but as humans, what they could do was limited. Nevertheless, he swore that he would solve the case of Sang's mother during his lifetime. Meanwhile, another ghost-related incident occurred. A friend of Young's rented a house, and the neighbors kept expressing concern, claiming that the ghost of a little girl haunted the house, whose cries could be heard at midnight. However, upon inquiry, her friend found out that the previous tenant only had a middle school-aged son and no girl. When Young went to her friend's new home for a visit, she stayed over for the night. She was abruptly woken at midnight to see several young men peeping in through the window and taking photos. She and her friend screamed like chickens and gave chase, but they lost them. The three boys scattered as they ran away, and the boy with the blue hat received a phone call from someone named Hyun. The boy was terrified and demanded to know why the person on the other end kept playing such cruel jokes. The person on the phone stayed silent, only weeping. The boy hung up the phone and saw a figure approaching. Young and her friend went to the police station to report the incident. After filing the report, they walked home only to find the blue-hatted boy dead on the stairs, face down with his hand twisted. Young couldn't help but recall what Sang had told her. Everyone she despised would die. Firstly, it was the scammer, and now this boy. She began to doubt whether all of this was just a coincidence. So Young went to find Sang, who admitted that he could see spirits. Young told him about the recent events, and Sang noticed that Young's shadow was the same size as before. It hadn't grown. He told Young that it was indeed a spirit that caused the boy to fall from the stairs, but it wasn't her doing. The real culprit was someone else. Young and Sang arrived at the funeral home, where they ran into two other peeping boys. However, Young recalled seeing not 3, but 4 peeping boys that day. She stopped them and asked about the fourth person, who had the numbers 4237 written on his hand. Upon hearing this, the boys became panicked. However, they insisted there were only 3 of them that night and no fourth person. The number Young mentioned was actually related to a boy named Hyun, who was already deceased. Young wanted to ask more, but Sang pulled her back, saying these boys were already possessed by spirits and she should not interfere further. Still worried, Young asked Sang what to do if she really encountered a spirit. Sang asked her to listen to the spirit's name and the reason it remained, and she should be careful of doors, for the world inside and outside the door are different. If someone knocks on the door, she should confirm their identity before opening it. Then, Sang got the information about the boy who fell from the stairs through Detective Senior. The boy had bullied a classmate who chose death due to the unbearable burden. To his shock, the deceased classmate was Hyun. Suspecting that Hyun had become an evil spirit, Sang visited his house, but no one answered the door. The neighbor turned him away when he understood his purpose, but Sang used the number 4237 to open Hyun's door, where he heard a little girl crying. Meanwhile, Young ran into another peeping boy. On seeing Young, the boy begged for mercy and told her that Hyun was already dead. However, he had been receiving calls from the deceased Hyun, and a little girl was constantly crying on the phone. The boy, deeply disturbed, insisted that Young come home with him to witness the mysterious calls. At the boy's house, Young noticed a door and remembered what Sang had told her. Looking into the mirror, she saw the deceased Hyun appearing within. She quickly pulled the boy away and fled from the place. Still shaken, Young asked the peeping boy about Hyun. Apparently, on the day of Hyun's death, the boy and his friends went to the roof and saw Hyun, who was in despair. Before dying, Hyun asked the 3 of them to visit his house after his death to see if anything would happen. The 3 didn't take it seriously at the time, but ever since Hyun's death, the boy had been receiving calls from him. The boy thought it was strange because Hyun had mentioned a younger sister whom he felt was pitiful. However, he had found out that Hyun didn't have a sister. Just then, Young saw Hyun's figure appearing in the mirror. Scared, she quickly dragged the boy away, but Hyun's spirit stubbornly followed them, appearing in any reflective object and pointing in a certain direction. Young, having no other choice, decided to follow its direction. Meanwhile, Sang managed to open the door to Hyun's house. He heard the crying of a little girl coming from within the house. Just as he was about to enter and investigate, Hyun's parents suddenly appeared. Seeing his suspicious behavior, they quickly threw him out. Sang noticed the unnatural look of Hyun's parents and became suspicious. He snuck around to the back alley, quietly opened a window and discovered a little girl crying in a corner. But the next moment, Sang was knocked unconscious. Soon after, Sang woke up from his unconscious state, his hands tied up inside the house. He overheard Hyun's parents' conversation. It turned out that the little girl was indeed Hyun's unregistered sister. She had been using Hyun's leftover phone to make calls for help. Hyun's father, worried about his secret of harboring a daughter being exposed, went to find the boy who answered the phone, inadvertently scaring him and causing the boy to fall down the stairs to his death. The parents conspired to get rid of the girl, reasoning that since she was not officially registered at birth, her disappearance would not raise any suspicion. Sang found a shard of glass to cut his bonds. He rushed to the window and began smashing the window bars. The moment he broke through, he rushed back to the room to block Hyun's parents who had come to investigate the noise. He then helped the little girl climb out through the window. Just then, Young, following the direction indicated by the Hyun's spirit, arrived at the scene and saved the child. Soon after, the police arrived and arrested Hyun's parents. Hyun's spirit shed tears before disappearing altogether. Young thought everything was over, but Sang noticed that the evil spirit still lingered on her. But Young denied the ghost's existence, saying that people were scarier than ghosts. With that, Sang remained silent and watched her leave. The incident with Hyun left Sang feeling melancholic. He drank his sorrows away, thinking about how he had been searching for the evil spirit responsible for his mother's death over the years until Young's father gave him a letter, asking him to protect his daughter who was possessed by an evil spirit. Sang was puzzled as to how Young's father knew about Young's possession. There was definitely something fishy going on, so he decided to start his investigation from Young. The next day, Sang arrived at Young's house to speak with Young's mother. He asked if Young had recently visited any eerie places or touched any suspicious items. Her mother recalled that Young had touched an old-style hairband that her grandmother had given her. Perhaps this hairband was the ominous item. Sang learned that the hairband was still with Young's grandmother and quickly left. At this time, Young was at her job, busy with moving. The homeowner's daughter was throwing a tantrum because she couldn't find her beloved toy. Young found a toy and asked the little girl if it was hers, but the girl flung it away, saying it wasn't the one. Watching the girl crying and rolling on the ground, Young could only suppress her anger and keep looking for the doll. After a long day's work, Young was about to sign out when her pen mysteriously slipped from her hand. She then arrived at a bench by the river, humming a little tune. A passerby saw her strange behavior and quickly left with their child. Young was mumbling, "If you're lucky enough to be born in a wealthy family, you shouldn't throw tantrums." Soon after, Young came to her senses and saw the doll in her hand. She was so scared that she threw it into the river and started to sprint until she was completely exhausted. She stopped right in front of a mirror. Young saw her disheveled reflection in the mirror, asking her to guess what her name was. Suddenly, Young saw a vision, like a scene from the eyes of an evil spirit, and it ended at her grandmother's house. Sensing that her grandmother was in danger, she quickly hopped on a bus to get there. At this time, her grandmother was flipping through Professor Gu's research notebook about the hairband. It recorded the history of a powerful witch and listed a series of ominous items, including the red hairband. Just as she finished reading, she heard a knock at the door. It was Sang, who wanted to see the red hairband. The grandmother handed the hairband to Sang. The moment he saw it, his hands started shaking. He asked where Young's father's research notes were. Before the grandmother could answer, she got a call from Young. Knowing her granddaughter was coming, she hurried to open the door, only to find a gloomy-looking Young outside. Meanwhile, Young, who was still on the road, saw a vision of an evil spirit following her grandmother. She sprinted towards her grandmother's house. Sang also noticed something was wrong. He saw a disheveled evil spirit floating past the window. Worried, he kicked open the door only to find the room filled with thick smoke and the grandmother barely alive. The research notes about the hairband had fallen into the fire. Fortunately, Young arrived and dialed the police, trying her best to put out the fire, but it was all in vain. By the time the firefighters arrived, her grandmother had already passed away. Young was devastated. She left her grandmother's house not even caring about the oncoming vehicles. Sang noticed something was wrong with Young and pulled her away from the road. Young was crying, and Sang didn't know how to comfort her. All he could do was promise her that he would help her figure everything out. After finishing his conversation, Sang went to find Detective Senior to help him retrieve the burnt notebook from the fire scene. He wanted to take it to the police station for restoration, as the content contained clues about the evil spirit that killed his mother. Detective Senior was already familiar with the case of Sang's mother. However, he did not believe that the case had anything to do with an evil spirit. Instead, he suspected that Young staged this evil spirit act to claim her grandmother's inheritance. When the detective returned to the police station and saw the photos from the crime scene, he was shocked to notice Young's grandmother had a dark red bruise on her wrist, identical to the one Young's father had before his death. The detective pulled out a stack of files, all of which were cases over the years that were ruled as suicides, but each victim had a dark red bruise on their wrists. He gave the files to his young partner, Detective Junior, wanting to investigate the matter together. It turned out that the first incident was a fire at a guest house in 1995. The police received a report of a woman who had ended her life inside the burning guest house. She had a red mark on her wrist. Her son, Sang, was found on a nearby mountain, muttering that his mother had been murdered. The police also witnessed the suspect disappearing from the scene, but ultimately failed to catch the perpetrator. Ever since then, similar cases had been happening. The two detectives decided to check any overlooked similar cases and find the key clues. Sang brought Young to his home. By now, Young could see the shadow of the evil spirit, which had grown stronger due to the increasing number of murders. Sang explained that the evil spirit had possessed Young through the hairband. He couldn't understand why Young's father had intentionally allowed the evil spirit to possess his daughter, and before dying, had left a letter asking him to protect Young. Upon learning the truth, Young was in disbelief and asked about the origins of the hairband. Sang then recounted a painful part of his past. In 1995, Sang's mother was glaring fiercely at her husband who was playing ball with their son. Not long after, her husband died. Sang, overwhelmed with grief, developed a high fever. His mother suddenly took him to a mountain on the outskirts of town and dug up a piece of ceramic shard, which seemed to be one of the ominous items mentioned in Professor Gu's research notes. While bored in the car, Sang found the hairband in a wooden box beside him. Soon after, mother and son stayed at a nearby guest house. Sang woke up in the middle of the night to find his mother and the hairband missing. There was a knock at the end of the far-off hallway, and then a sudden scream from his mother from behind. He fell to the ground as if possessed by the evil spirit, his hands bound with a rope, controlled and dragged away by the evil spirit. He lit a lighter and threw it on the ground. His mother desperately tried to throw away the hairband, but was killed by the evil spirit. Since then, in order to investigate his mother's death, Sang has been asking around and found a paper written by Professor Gu, Young's father. The evil spirit described in the paper was exactly the same as the one that killed his mother. Sang wanted to ask Professor Gu but was turned away. Now all he knew was that the evil spirit was a disheveled shadow that grew after satisfying human desires. If he could find out how Professor Gu got the haunted hairband, he might be able to solve the mystery of the evil spirit. Suddenly, Young remembered that she had seen her father's research notes through the visions of the evil spirit. Using her memory, she drew the route map from the notebook. The map marked words like red hairband, sacred tree, and an arrow pointing to a place called Jiangjin Village. Following the map, Sang and Young set out to find Jiangjin Village. However, they discovered that this place name had long been lost to time. The pair had no choice but to delve into historical records and, at last, located where Jiangjin Village once stood. The scene then flashed back to Jiangjin Village in 1958, when a group of girls was gathered under a sacred tree. A shaman, holding a hairband, was selecting a girl among them. Soon the shaman retreated to a secluded chamber, laying a bowl of raw meat on the ground. Without hesitation, she murdered the girl, blood dripping onto the hairband, indicating the origin of the haunted hairband. Sang and Young found the place depicted on the map. What was once a forest had turned into a residential area. They asked around, trying to find if any elderly locals once lived in a place called Jiangjin Village. Their persistence paid off when they found an old man. Though he himself did not live in Jiangjin Village, his brother did. The old man recognized the map that Young had drawn. He pointed out that the end of the road led to a tree. Sang's spine chilled upon hearing this. He understood the custom. Due to past customs, children were not buried in ancestral graves, but placed in a barrel and hung from a tree, hence the name Hanging Tree. Many desperate souls also ended their lives there. Sang and Young sought to meet the old man's brother, but he had passed away. However, he still had a few relatives alive, one of them named Juan, who now lived in the Examination Institute. Through the old man, Sang and Young obtained her address and promptly headed there. Upon disembarking from their vehicle, Sang noticed ghostly objects on the Examination Institute building. Through a mirror, Young also spotted tree shadows filled with hanging deceased on the wall. One of the ropes was still empty. The pair rushed into the building, encountering detectives who were also investigating a recent case. It's revealed that a male student had been studying alone in his room when he heard high heels outside his door. The sound approached, followed by a knock. Fearfully, the student opened the door to see a woman in red high heels. Not long after, he was found dead. The student was a senior, and his death was one of 3 similar cases. All victims were senior students at a local university and lived in the same community, which aroused the detectives' suspicions. On the school forum, anonymous posts claimed that strange sounds of high heels and knocking were heard when the victims died. As their investigations continued, the detectives discovered that these victims, who came from modest backgrounds, had all kept an expensive type of fish. Their common friend, Juan, was also a senior at the university, but had recently disappeared mysteriously. Detective Senior had tracked the case here, coincidentally meeting Sang. Sang informed the detective that the students' deaths were not suicides, but the work of a ghost. The vacant spot on the rope indicated another incident would occur soon, but the detective was still skeptical. While they talked, Young eavesdropped on a conversation between the young detective and a manager, learning that one had not returned to the Examination Institute for some time. The next day, Sang visited the old man again. The man revealed that the hanging tree was a pine tree. He produced an old photograph with the tree in the background. Sang instantly recognized it as the tree whose shadow he had seen at the Examination Institute the previous day. Meanwhile, Young was inquiring about Juan at the university. A man claiming to be Juan's friend found her and invited her to his shop. The shop, packed with fish tanks, turned out to be a pet fish store. Young asked the man about Juan's whereabouts, but he quickly realized that Young was not Juan's friend. Instead, he probed Young with many questions, gathering a good deal of information from her. He learned that Juan's uncle was still alive and even obtained the uncle's address. The man suggested that the shop owner might know more and asked Young to wait. When the owner arrived, he showed no interest or knowledge about Juan's whereabouts. What intrigued him was a phone call Young had received, revealing her financial desperation. He offered to lend her money. Just as Young was about to respond, her mother called, saying she was at the police station. After hastily saying goodbye, Young left. The shop owner gave her a fish tank on her way out. Young returned home to be confronted by her mother. The reason for her mother's visit to the police station was that the police had informed her of her grandmother's death. Her mother had only learned of her grandmother's demise that day, and Young had been at the scene when it happened. Her mother scolded Young for not sharing such crucial news. In addition, her grandmother had left all her inheritance to Young. Her mother advised Young to accept it. Just then, Young felt dizzy, as if someone whispered, "Accept it," in her ear. Panicked, Young stumbled out of the house. Detective Senior kept recalling what Sang had told him. There would be another victim. He couldn't rest easy and decided to continue his investigations. Through surveillance footage, he and his partner quickly zeroed in on a woman wearing red high heels. Security cameras in the victim's apartment building showed this woman appearing regularly. According to the security guard, she claimed to be the victim's friend and went by the name One. Both detectives found it strange. It was natural for One to visit her friends, but her appearance at the same time each week, wearing the same clothes, was suspicious. Even stranger, she would have to pass by a convenience store when leaving the building. But despite checking the store's surveillance footage multiple times, they only saw her enter the store, never leaving. The detectives visited Juan's uncle and his wife to ask about One. The old lady finally admitted that she knew One was missing. One had gone into hiding due to high-interest debt. Initially, she only borrowed a small amount, but the interest snowballed and she lost control of her debt. With things getting to this point, the old lady finally stopped hiding information and revealed Juan's current hiding place. On the other side, Young had also stumbled upon the secret. She had left her house to find the shop owner at the pet fish store. However, upon spotting Juan's debt statement, she realized that this was not a fish store at all, but an illegal loan organization. As Young prepared to leave, she accidentally knocked over a mirror. In the reflection, she saw the hanging tree spreading across the ceiling. Just then, the shop owner returned, and seeing that Young had discovered the truth, his demeanor changed. He threatened Young into signing a loan contract. He laughed arrogantly, thankful to Young for revealing that One had relatives from whom he could collect the debt. Young remembered that she had given the address of Juan's uncle earlier. She realized that her mistake might have put the old couple in danger. Young managed to escape and immediately noticed Sang that the old man was in danger. Sang had been investigating the hanging tree and had found the location of the pine forest in Jangjin village. However, all the pine trees there had been scrapped years ago. The tree was no longer there, but the ghost still existed. Sang checked a group photo and suspected that the ghost was now attached to the photo. He had heard that Juan also had this picture and realized that she might be in danger. He needed to find her as soon as possible to prevent her from becoming the next victim. As Sang passed by the university, he noticed that all the students were wearing the same cultural shirts. He had seen this shirt at the old man's house. The old man's wife had been evasive then, which suggested that the couple had something to hide. Sang instantly returned. Just as he arrived at the old man's front door, he received a call from Young. He immediately entered the house and found it in chaos, with traces on the floor that resembled high-heeled shoe marks. Following these marks, Sang made his way to the warehouse where he heard a frantic knocking on the door. For a moment, he felt as though he was back in the darkness before his mother's death. Overcoming his fear, he walked forward to open the door, only to find nothing outside. Meanwhile, the old couple went to find Juan with the police. It turns out the woman in the red high heels was a member of the loan shark gang, disguised to force people to repay loans. At this moment, she had found Juan's hiding place and was pressuring her to repay the money. Just as she was about to harm Juan, the police burst in and arrested her. Juan was rescued and cried in remorse. Under the coercion of the loan shark, she had reluctantly introduced her poor friends to borrow money, leading to a tragedy. Sang stayed to help the old couple clean up their home. The old man told Sang that Juan had destroyed the photo she had. When the loan shark gang asked her to confess who her relatives were, Juan, in order to avoid detection, tore up the photo and threw it into the fish tank. The ghost attached to the photo ended up in the fish tank, and perhaps this was why anyone who took home a fish tank ended up dead. Sang immediately alerted the police, who were also preparing to search the shop. From Detective Senior, Sang learned that Young had been to the shop as well and had brought back a fish tank. He couldn't help but worry that the last rope on the tree was meant for Young. He tried to contact her but couldn't get through. When the police arrived at the shop, it was in a state of disarray. The shop owner was curled up in a corner, looking terrified with red marks on his hands. Detective Senior was shocked. Reviewing the security footage, they found that the shop owner had smashed the fish tanks himself. Young was seen standing by, an evil smile on her face. Meanwhile, Young, holding the fish tank, had arrived at the riverbank. When Sang found her, she turned around, her disheveled silhouette cast on the ground. Obviously possessed, Young greeted Sang with an eerie smile. Sang was horrified, realizing that the demon that killed his mother years ago was back. Young then laughed, a chilling sound that sent shivers down his spine. Sang had done his research. The kind of hairband Young was wearing was usually given to children when their hair first started to grow. It was more like a talisman, embodying good wishes and blessings. Sang set off to investigate the owner of the hairband, confident that he could find out the demon's name this way. Young was muttering two numbers, 21 and 176, before coming to her senses. She was a bit confused, not remembering what she did while possessed or how she ended up at the bridge. On the way to Young's home, Sang stopped by the bank. Knowing about Young's financial difficulties, he withdrew some money for her. Despite her initial refusal, she accepted Sang's kindness. Her mother strongly opposed this. She didn't want her daughter to have any entanglements with him. Young went to her grandmother's house. Her father had a deep understanding of demons and must have known what the two numbers meant. She tried to find clues in her father's books. While doing so, she heard the door being pushed open. Scared, Young went to the door and observed through the mirror. It turned out Sang had come, hoping to understand the meaning of the two numbers. The book Young was reading was the only published work of Professor Gu. Sang knew the book, but the numbers were not in there. The two continued their separate search for clues, but to no avail. Young noticed there was a talisman rope in the house, a taboo item used to ward off evil spirits. Normally, it should be hung from a high hook outside, but here it was indoors. Then Young noticed a hidden door. Behind it was the house where her parents lived before their divorce. Various details reflected Professor Gu's longing for Young and her mother. Young also noticed a date circled on the calendar, marked as the due date. But it wasn't Young's birthday. She was already 5 years old at that time. To find more clues, they went to see One again. Her mood was stable now. She remembered seeing Professor Gu. One recalled that her grandfather was visited by Professor Gu during his hospital stay a year ago. He was holding a report about a missing girl named Mok Dan. Juan's uncle also remembered the missing case. It caused a stir in the village. It was 1958. A group of children were playing hide and seek. Mock Dan wanted to find a hiding place and saw a woman waving at her under a tree. The tree was full of colorful ropes. Mock Dan disappeared in the process. Some said she was kidnapped by outsiders. Rumors were rampant and the girl was never found. Meanwhile, the two detectives were investigating the disappearance of Mock Dan. Not long ago, Detective Senior reviewed the surveillance video of the fish tanks being smashed. He zoomed in on the footage and saw Young laughing at the time. The detective found it strange, especially when thinking about the red marks on the shop owner's wrists. Everything seemed too eerie. The detective heard from a colleague that Young's grandmother's death was ruled as suicide. There were many doubts about this case, but they couldn't find any other evidence. A part of Professor Gu's notebook was restored. Detective Senior obtained a photocopy of the notebook. On it was the news of the girl's disappearance. The detective found the officer who was in charge of the disappearance case back in the day. The old officer recalled that the girl Mock Dan was found after missing for several days. Her death was brutal. It seemed she had starved for several days, emaciated and missing a finger. He was sure that this was man-made. The detectives then found the daughter of the reporter who wrote the article. According to her memory, her father died at home the day the article was published. Detective Senior hurriedly asked if there were any bruises on her father's wrists when he died. After receiving an affirmative answer, he felt the case was more complicated. The daughter also mentioned that someone came to inquire about this matter a year ago. That person was Professor Gu. At this point, the detective realized that Professor Gu was the central figure in this case. It seemed necessary to start the investigation from him. At the same time, Sang and Young also found related evidence. They went to the library. After some searching, Young noticed a news article. It wrote about an old sorcerer who kidnapped a little girl, starved her for 17 days, killed her, and took her finger as a relic. Sang explained that there indeed exists a cruel form of witchcraft, which refers to making dolls out of straw or branches to curse others, or starving young humans to death, turning them into ghosts. This kidnapped little girl named Mock Dan, after experiencing such cruel treatment, became a child ghost, which refers to children who died young. Young remembered her father's notebook mentioned child ghosts, so she turned to the page introducing child ghosts. At that moment, she realized that the page number was 176. Then she turned to page 21. The content also pointed to the child ghost. The true meaning of the mysterious numbers was cracked. These two pages mentioned the scarecrow of Bakechaggle, so the two of them drove to Bakechaggle village. At this moment, a grandma in Bakechaggle village heard a frantic knocking at the door. The person outside was calling her mother, but in reality there was no one outside. Recently, there have been frequent deaths in the village. Sang had previously conducted research in this area, and his return was welcomed by the villagers. The village head showed them a video of an event involving scarecrow dolls, a ritual used to drive away ghosts of people who died far from their hometowns. Unable to return to their homeland, these souls are known as wandering ghosts. Sang asked among the older villagers if anyone remembered Professor Gu, and an old man claimed to remember Professor Gu, who had married a girl from a local family. The girl was Young's mother. It was only at this moment that Young came to realize that her mother's hometown was Bakechaggle village. Young called her mother to ask about this, and when her mother learned that Young was in Bakechaggle, she became emotional and demanded that she leave immediately. While they were still on the call, chaos erupted as an old man fell to the ground and couldn't get back up. In the mirror next to her, Young saw a ghost. Sang explained to Young that this was a wandering ghost, and anyone possessed by them would die. The old man had had an accident because of it. Young looked in the mirror and found a wandering ghost behind her. She was startled, and Sang told her that the number of wandering ghosts in the village was astonishing. Sang advised the villagers to go home immediately, to keep their eyes on the ground and not to look back on their way. They should lock their doors as soon as they got home. Next, he asked the village chief for a scarecrow doll because they had a strong effect in driving away wandering ghosts. The scarecrow dolls were kept in the ancestral hall. When he went to retrieve them with Sang and Young, they found that the dolls had disappeared. The chief distinctly remembered them being there when he cleaned the hall in the morning. That meant the two other elderly who had helped clean the hall must have taken them. Young went to find one of the elderlies. When she found her, she was just about to cross the road. It looked like she was about to be hit by the car, but luckily, Young managed to save her in time. When Young asked her where the scarecrow doll was, the elderly replied that she hadn't been feeling well that day and had not gone to clean the ancestral hall. Moreover, one of the elderlies hadn't shown up, and the cleaning had been done by Grandma Park alone. Sang found Grandma Park at home, but when he approached, he saw a terrifying scene. A female ghost was sitting across the table from her. Sang warned she to be careful, but she was not flustered because she could see ghosts too. Grandma Park asked the female ghost why she had come back. It turned out that the ghost was her daughter, who had hated the dull countryside and gone to the big city years ago, but had ended up taking her own life. Grandma Park saw the youthful face of her daughter when she was still alive. She reached out to touch her daughter's face, expressing her willingness to be possessed. She admitted to Sang that she had taken the Scarecrow doll because she was worried that the expulsion of the wandering ghosts would scare her daughter. Furthermore, she had already burned the doll. At the same moment, Young was at a crossroad, seeing many ghosts trailing behind her. Overwhelmed by fear, she broke into a run. Midway, Young tripped and fell, catching sight of her father in the reflection of a nearby glass. In Bakeshagol village, restless, wandering ghosts were stirring. Even the village chief felt the presence of these spirits. Meanwhile, Sang was watching a video of the Scarecrow ritual, trying to understand how Grandma Park had managed to summon the wandering ghosts. He noticed a sacred pillar in the video, located at the four corners of the village. It played the role of the village's guardian deity and served as a guiding sign for the villagers. No wonder their car's navigation had malfunctioned as soon as they arrived at the village. Realizing this, Sang concluded that Grandma Park must have used the sacred pillar to guide the ghosts. Sang decided to find the pillar. Before leaving, he turned the volume of the video to the maximum, broadcasting the sound of the Scarecrow ritual throughout the village. The wandering ghosts shrieked upon hearing it. Upon reaching the sacred pillar at the northern end of the village, Sang discovered that someone had used fresh blood to change the north direction on the pillar to the south. This act was equivalent to blocking the path to the underworld, trapping the ghosts here. Sang began to cut down the pillar, but was stopped midway by Grandma Park. She fell to her knees, humbly pleading with Sang for a one-day extension to bid a final goodbye to her daughter. However, Sang showed no mercy and continued to cut down the pillar. The figure of the daughter gradually disappeared into thin air. While Young saw her father in the reflection, he told her something cryptic, that this was not him, and he had no other choice before he disappeared. Overwhelmed by sadness and regret, Young fainted. Young was taken to the hospital. The crisis of the wandering ghosts had been resolved. Sang stayed by her bedside with concern. Young's mother also rushed to the hospital. Young asked her mother to reveal all the hidden truths about her father. However, her mother evaded the question. Young asked about what had happened on February 25th when she was 5 years old, the date marked as the expected delivery date on the calendar. Hearing this, her mother faltered and revealed some past events. That day was supposed to be the birth date of Young's sibling. Young was supposed to have a younger brother or sister. However, as Young's mother was looking forward to the birth of her second child, Professor Gu, as if possessed by an evil spirit, said menacingly that the second child would die by his hands. He left without any explanation after hearing Young crying. Fearing for her life, Young's mother decided to return to her hometown, Bakeshagol village. She couldn't bear it and told her mother about these events. That night, she had a nightmare where her husband stood beside her bed saying the second child must die. She woke up to find no one in the room, but realized she was covered in blood and she lost her second child. From her mother, she learned that her husband had indeed visited that night, wearing a strange expression. She was terrified. Her mother comforted her, telling her to rest and recover while she went to Seoul to bring Young back. However, Young's grandmother lost contact after she left. After being discharged from the hospital, Young's mother searched everywhere for her mother, finally finding her in the backyard of their house. The old lady was by the well as if something was pulling her. She warned Young's mother not to approach and to take Young away from there. After that, she was dragged into the well. Terrified, the mother took Young and left the terrifying village to start a new life. Recently, Detective Senior has been spending all day in the archive room, trying to find any clues related to the case. Detective Junior had sorted out some suspicious case files and brought them to him. The first victim was a literature professor at a university who was a colleague of Professor Gu. He despised Professor Gu, seeing him as a cult member and a fraud. The second victim was Professor Gu's mother-in-law, Young's grandmother. The third victim was once a student of Professor Gu. The fourth victim was a librarian who had seen Professor Gu the day before his death. These victims all died under similar circumstances, with ligature marks on their wrists. Detective Senior took these case records to Sang. While flipping through the records, Sang discovered a suicide note left by Professor Gu at the crime scene. It stated that he wished his daughter to have his hair banned. Sang found this odd. He recalled when Young saw the ghost of Professor Gu, who had said that he was not himself. Sang speculated that the person who wrote the suicide note was not Professor Gu himself, but an evil spirit. Young also came to find Sang. After being discharged from the hospital, Young had been pestering her mother to tell her about her father. She wanted to know what kind of person her father really was. Young's mother recalled the scene when she first met Professor Gu many years ago. At that time, Professor Gu came to the village for field research. They met, and Professor Gu was a good listener, paying close attention to all the old stories that no one else cared about. At first, Young's mother thought he liked her. Later, after they got married and had a child, Professor Gu became strange, always saying some terrifying things like, "The second child must die." He once mentioned the Jiangjin village, which also had this custom. The second child in the family line would keep dying off. Listening to Young's story, Sang was reminded of a custom in Jiangjin village. Whenever something unlucky happened, the villagers would summon the child ghost to ward off calamity. The sacrificial child for summoning the child ghost must be the second child. The missing girl, Mok Dan, whom they had previously investigated, was the second child in her family. Perhaps she didn't die at the hands of an evil spirit, but was killed by the villagers. Sang prepared to investigate further. At this moment, Young was suddenly possessed by a ghost who asked Sang about what Detective Senior had told him. Sang brushed it off with a vague answer. Young didn't notice that there was another ghost in the room. The ghost's eyes were red, and Sang saw a kind of greed in his eyes. He was coveting Young's youth. Sang scolded him, saying that even as a ghost he couldn't escape his evil deeds. The ghost retorted that it was Sang who had turned him into this. Later, Young's friend hosted a wedding party, inviting acquaintances for a meal. Young and her best friend agreed to attend, but Young was late, prompting her friend to send her a stream of urgent messages. The friend, who had just passed the civil service exam, was excited and mentioned it several times at the dinner table. Just then, a stunning woman walked past the friend to the restroom. After freshening up her makeup, she noticed the restroom was swarming with bugs, and even more were crowded outside the window. A figure approached her from behind. This woman was also one of the attendees, but she never returned, leaving behind only a designer bag at her seat. The friend recognized it as the bag of the woman she met outside the restroom. Detective Junior also attended the gathering. He and Young were high school classmates and knew each other. Young arrived late, dressed in a gorgeous outfit with exquisite makeup. It was unlike her usual appearance. Her friend found this strange, and Detective Junior observed from the side. He sat next to Young, who was alluring in a languid sort of way. She leaned in and whispered in his ear that she would kill them all. As they were talking, the friend accidentally spilled a glass of wine. The bride suddenly lashed out at her. It turned out the bride had long harbored resentment towards the friend, who had been bragging all day about passing the civil service exam, overshadowing her. Suddenly, Young stood up and splashed wine all over the bride, telling her to get out. After defending her friend, Young questioned why her friend would attend such a show-off event. Was it because she wanted to brag? Everyone present was stunned, unable to understand why Young's demeanor had changed so much. After a moment of silence, Young seemed to sober up. Seeing the look in her friend's eyes, as well as her unfamiliar attire, Young felt a wave of terror. She quickly left the scene, stumbling on her way home. As she crossed the bridge again, she yelled in despair for the other soul inside her to shut up. Meanwhile, Sang was still studying the paper left by Professor Gu. He noticed a sentence stating that only the breath of the victim could suppress items filled with evil spirits. Sang remembered the village chief who had accompanied him to investigate at Young's grandmother's house, who had tripped over a rope in the yard. He immediately asked the chief about the structure of the rope. A right-twisted rope was normal, but a left-twisted one was a forbidden sign. With the chief's confirmation that it was left-twisted, Sang rushed over. The two dug up something strange in the yard. Sang was astonished, thinking it was something his mother had buried. Just as Sang made this discovery, Young was possessed again. The evil spirit, with a terrifying face, said, "Found it." Once sober, she realized her bizarre behavior and felt broken inside. She went to a bridge alone to cool off. Detective Junior followed and comforted her. Young told him that she had killed those people, so he specifically came to verify this. Young was panicked and didn't remember what she had said. She explained to Detective Junior that everything was done by the ghost, but he believed Young wouldn't kill. On her way home, Young pulled out a disc from her pocket, a shopping receipt from not long ago, and a card from Sang. It seemed that Young's new look was entirely funded by Sang's money. When Young returned home, she found that her mother had rented a shop. Her mother had unilaterally accepted her grandmother's inheritance. Young felt helpless, and the image of her killing her grandmother resurfaced in her mind. She screamed at her mother in blame. At this moment, Young heard a voice asking her if she wanted to kill her mother. Young was terrified. She immediately locked her mother outside the room and sealed the door tightly to prevent herself from harming her mother. Elsewhere, the village chief dug up a strange item. It was a forbidden rope inlaid with small knives, and the rope bound a piece of broken pottery. Sang took this forbidden rope and asked a friend to help find the person who made the rope. Sang returned home. His family was well off, and he was the only heir to the family business. The deputy president of the group always hoped he would return to work, but Sang had no interest in the family business. When Sang returned to his long unseen home, he found cameras installed in every corner. When he was a child, Sang witnessed his mother burying something strange before she died. After that, he started seeing ghosts. Initially, he could only see them through mirrors. Later, he could see them directly with his naked eyes. When Sang questioned his grandmother about it, she told him to shut up his smelly mouth and never mention it again. He took out the broken pottery surrounded by the forbidden rope and the red hairband his mother held before she died. His grandmother looked at the items and ordered Sang to leave. Sang returned to his residence and analyzed the situation with the ghost boy in his house. What his mother had buried back then was likely the item of the missing girl Mock, who had turned into the child ghost. According to Professor Gu's paper, the purpose of sealing an item with a forbidden rope at the place where an evil spirit had killed someone was to exterminate the evil spirit. The ghost boy thought this was only Sang's view. He advised Sang to stop, or he might end up like his mother. Just then, Young came to find Sang. Sang then discovered his credit card had been maxed out. Young paid him back with a large sum of cash. Sang was suspicious about the source of the money, but Young didn't say anything. Knowing she had something to hide, Sang decided to investigate starting from the card transaction records. Young used her grandmother's money to pay back Sang. She felt guilty and went to her grandmother's house to clean it from top to bottom. Exhausted, Young fell into a deep sleep, snoring like a pig. When she woke up, she continued her busy work. Suddenly, she heard that voice whisper in her ear again, guiding her to check the drawer of the dressing table. Young was startled, trying to ignore the spirit's words, but still involuntarily opened the drawer. Inside was a roll of film. Young sent the film for processing and previewed the photos on her computer. Among them, she found several photos full of religious connotations. The content of the photos pointed to the starving ghost in Buddhist legends. On Sang's side, he reviews the swipe records from Young, leading them to the restaurant where Young and her friends gather for a party. It becomes apparent that this place is a crime scene. The previous night, a woman adorned in luxury brands was found dead in the restroom. Her death was horrifying, with bloodshot eyes. Sang meets Detective Junior at the scene, who notices a colleague working on the case. After inquiring about it, it is revealed that the woman died of sudden cardiac arrest. However, at the scene, traces of the body being dragged into a cubicle were found. Among the woman's belongings, a luxury bag was missing. A colleague brings out a photo of the bag, and Detective Junior recognizes it, having seen it on the dinner table the day before. Sang asks him if the deceased had bloodshot eyes. Detective Junior is curious about how Sang knows this, and Sang replies it was told by a starving ghost. After Sang leaves, Detective Junior analyzes the case and finds many similar cases in old records. All victims died of congested eyes and cardiac paralysis. The cases are spread across different jurisdictions, and the police did not realize they were connected. However, Sang could easily predict similar cases would continue to happen. Detective Junior goes to find Sang, and coincidentally, Young also comes to him. They discuss the legend of the starving ghost. Detective believes that the perpetrator is likely among the friends at the party. Sang asks for a photo of the party, claiming he can identify those possessed by a ghost from the image. Young finds a group photo from the bride's social media, but Sang sees nothing unusual. Instead, Young notices that two people are missing from the photo, the bride and her best friend. Young refuses to believe her best friend is capable of murder and sets off with Sang to find her. Sang tells her that a starving ghost is different from an evil spirit. It arises from insatiable desires and cannot be eliminated. He then shares that he has a friend who was possessed by such a ghost who always coveted others' belongings. Unable to bear this version of himself, he chose to end his life. Unknown to Young, the ghost friend mentioned by Sang is the ghost boy staying at his house. At this moment, Young's friend, carrying the same bag as the deceased woman, is meeting with the bride. The friend admires the bride's clothes. She's preparing for an interview and doesn't have suitable attire, so she asks to borrow the bride's clothes, only to be ridiculed for her poverty. Meanwhile, Detective Junior investigates previous cases and notices that each victim lost something valuable, like a watch or high heels. Only in one case, nothing was lost. He is perplexed and discovers that the deceased woman was planning a wedding before her death, which was canceled afterward. The person who took over their wedding plans was the bride. Detective Junior finds the bride's husband, who insists that with their financial status, they could not afford a wedding at a high-end venue. But the bride was adamant about holding the ceremony at such a location. She also prepared some luxury brands and insisted he wear them at the wedding. Detective Junior notices one of the brands is a watch. He feels he is close to the truth. At this moment, the bride is meeting with her friend. Her eyes are red. She looks like she's possessed by the starving ghost. A woman walks by with something on her wrist that catches the bride's attention. The bride follows her into the restroom and stares at the woman, who feels her neck tightening and begins to suffocate. Young, after searching, finally finds her friend. She arrives at the store just in time to rush to the restroom, stop the bride, and save the woman. The bride looks into the mirror and sees her red eyes reflecting back at her. She feels terrified, screams like a chicken, and runs out. Young follows but can't catch up and watches in horror as the bride is hit by a car in the middle of the road. The police review the restaurant's surveillance footage and identify the person who took the luxury bag as the bride. The bride is taken to the hospital, narrowly avoiding death. Sang tells Young that in the past, people would leave offerings at their doorsteps for poor, unknown spirits. Even in times of scarcity, they were generous. Today, despite abundant living, the starving ghosts cannot be satisfied. They will find people who desire something as they do and possess them. After that, Young went to get the photos. To her horror, she found a human figure in one of the photos. This person was the ghost boy from Sang's house. The last time Young went to Sang's house, she had accidentally seen the ghost boy reflected in the glass. Once again, she arrived at Sang's house. Sang was not there, but the door was left open. Young walked inside and saw the ghost boy in the mirror, suddenly understanding why the evil spirit inside her led her to the starving ghost. Its target wasn't the bride and her friend, but the ghost boy at Sang's house. Young asked the ghost boy what he knew, but the ghost was clueless. Meanwhile, Sang found the old lady who made the forbidden ropes. She revealed that a year ago, she had made 5 forbidden ropes for Professor Gu, who had also mentioned finding 5 items and knowing the name of the evil spirit. Sang asked the old lady if she had made forbidden ropes for anyone else before and showed her a photo with his mother. The old lady recognized the woman in the picture, revealing she had also made 5 forbidden ropes for her. It turns out Sang's mother found the old lady on Professor Gu's recommendation. The ghost boy in Sang's house gave Young a clue: find a great witch. After delivering his message, the ghost vanished. Young searched for him and unexpectedly ended up in Sang's studio. There, she found a hairband and ceramic fragments. Touching the fragments brought back fragmented memories. Intrigued by the ghost boy, Young reconstructed the school emblem on the ghost's uniform from memory and found the corresponding school. In 1999, the boy lived in Sang's house under his father's guidance. From then on, the boy and Sang lived in the same house, gradually getting to know each other. One day, the boy discovered the storage room in Sang's house and wanted to take a peek. Sang stopped him, and the boy's eyes suddenly turned red. He seemed like a different person as he said that Sang had so much, yet he didn't know what he possessed. Sang was frightened. The boy came back to his senses and didn't remember what he had just said. Since then, the boy often snuck into the study when no one was looking, drooling over the expensive camera. Underneath the camera was the Great Witch's information. Young asked Detective Junior to investigate any cases of self-harm at the boys' middle school. After investigating, the detective found no students who had committed suicide. However, there were several mysterious deaths. The victims' eyes were all red, which Young knew was a sign of possession by a starving ghost. They approached a teacher from the school who recalled that the deceased students seemed to have all lost something. This confirmed Young's suspicion that they were killed by the starving ghost. When asked about the thief's name, the teacher remembered a boy who turned out to be the ghost boy. After the students died, the victims' belongings were found in the boy's locker. When questioned by the teacher, the boy seemed like a different person. The teacher remembered that the boy used to be lively and was not like this at all. Perhaps his sudden change was due to the grief of losing his mother. Not long after, the boy died in a car accident. Meanwhile, the old lady remembered that Sang's mother had visited her to have 5 forbidden ropes made, introduced to her by Professor Gu. The two had apparently met during a field investigation. The old lady couldn't offer more information but remembered that when they left, they asked her to chant prayers for a deceased child. Later, the old lady pulled out an old record. It noted the name of the dead child, who had died in the womb before birth on March 17, 1995. Sang later met with Detective Senior and shared the possibility that the evil spirit might be seeking revenge because of this unborn sibling, as the evil spirit was a child ghost. The detective also shared what he had discovered in Professor Gu's notebook. He found a report on the Mock case, written by a reporter who had ended his life shortly after publishing it. The reporter had red bruises on his wrist. In the case files of Mock, the suspect was the Great Witch. After Mock's death, the police found his clothes and severed fingers in the witch's house, leading to her immediate arrest. While the Great Witch was held in custody, she was terrified by a violent knocking on the door one night, warning the guard not to open it. However, the guard opened the door. Unbeknownst to the guard, the Great Witch saw a man standing outside her cell, staring at her. Not long afterward, the Great Witch was found dead in her cell with red bruises on her wrists. Following the lead of the Great Witch, Sang found her grandnephew. Sang presented several items, including a hairband, which the grandnephew recognized as items needed to summon the child ghost. It's revealed that in 1958, with the Yangjin village suffering from natural disasters and harsh living conditions, the superstitious villagers chose to resort to such brutal witchcraft. All the second-born children were gathered together, and the Great Witch, after scanning the crowd, selected Mock. The grandnephew found the Great Witch's notebook, which recorded the day she summoned the child ghost and received a substantial amount of money. Sang took a closer look and saw that the payer was a trading company. Sang was stunned by the familiar company name. He searched for the name of the owner of the trading company and found it was his deceased grandfather. Detective Senior further analyzed that the Mock's case was hastily closed not long after it occurred. It was highly likely that the detective in charge at the time had received a bribe from the trading company, leading to the case's rapid conclusion. Clearly, the case was tied to Sang's family. Young, relying on the information she found in the Ghost Boy's school records, also conducted an investigation into Sang's family. Young dialed the phone number left in the Ghost Boy's file, and Sang's grandmother answered. Young asked her about the Great Witch, but Sang's grandmother let out a mournful wail over the phone before abruptly hanging up and could not be reached again. Young decided to visit the address, but Detective Junior reminded her that it was Sang's grandparents' house. He further shared his investigation of Sang's grandparents, founders of the trading company. During the Japanese occupation, the trading company faced financial difficulties due to rapid expansion and war. However, after resolving its financial issues, it established a loan business, quickly rising to become a new financial power. Young noticed that Sang's grandfather became the company president in 1958. She remembered the Jiangjin village case, which also happened in 1958. In the records was a photo of the trading company, which Young had seen before. Suddenly, her vision blurred. She saw a girl dressed in ancient clothes crossing the road, but strangely, only she could see the girl. Without hesitation, Young chased after the girl, following her into an alley. Suddenly, the scene before her eyes dramatically changed. It was as if she had been transported back to 1958, when the Great Witch took the young Mock away. Young saw them enter a large blue door. It was the house of Sang's grandmother. Young was overwhelmed with a profound realization. It seemed she had witnessed the process of Mock's sacrifice. She saw the Great Witch raise a dagger high, and she let out a painful wail. Mock was shut in a room, covered with a blue oilcloth, and the Great Witch killed her through the cloth. The hairband fell to the ground, and the moment Sang's grandfather picked it up, the evil spirit began to possess him. Back in the day, to save the company from crisis, both grandparents sought out the Great Witch, who warned them that if they carried out the evil ritual, the head of their family for generations would be haunted by the evil spirit. The spirit would fulfill their wishes, but they would also have to pay the price. Fearless and desperate to get what they wanted, they were willing to pay any price. Even now, when faced with Sang's questioning, the grandmother showed no remorse. She argued that if they hadn't made the deal with the evil spirit, Sang wouldn't be enjoying his affluent lifestyle. As for Sang's mother's death, she was killed by the evil spirit because she tried to prevent it from possessing Sang after his father's death. Sang, in a daze, walked out of the house, meeting a crying Young standing in the rain. Young couldn't help but lash out at Sang, accusing him of living a life of luxury built on the death of innocence. She picked up a rock and smashed Sang's luxurious car. Sang didn't stop her, knowing he had no right to. Alone, Sang went to a bridge. The ghost boy followed him. He realized that Sang had now known the whole truth. Back in 1999, the ghost boy was hiding in a study, flipping through books. Suddenly, someone entered and he quickly hid. It was Sang's grandmother and Professor Gu. The ghost boy, hiding in the corner, overheard the secret of how the grandmother had sacrificed an innocent girl to establish a fortune. Professor Gu was there to learn from her how to obtain an evil spirit, indicating that he was also eager to learn the shortcut to wealth and power. From that moment, the ghost boy knew the family's wealth came from a deal with the evil spirit. Sang was struggling with himself, realizing that his prestigious family background was a lie. If not for what his grandparents had left him, he would have nothing. At this point, a black shadow gradually spread. The ghost boy quickly warned him not to fall into despair, but Sang couldn't escape the feeling. To save Sang, the ghost boy stood in front of him. Sang watched helplessly as the ghost boy was swept away by the black shadow, disappearing beneath the bridge with a scream. Meanwhile, Young returned to her grandmother's house. She confronted her own shadow, addressing the evil spirit within her, insisting that she was different from the others. By now, Young had discovered the name and story of the evil spirit. She would send the girl where she belonged. After saying this, she walked into the house. Suddenly, the doors and windows began shaking. A feminine voice told Young, "It was you who first desired me. Just like your father, you too will crave my presence." Not long before, Detective Jr. had told his senior that Sang's family company had secretly tried to bribe him for an investigation. Detective Senior found this strange, and so he investigated the company. As a result, he found 4 cases of suicide. All of the victims had red bruises on their wrists, and all clues pointed to the trading company. The detective sorted through this series of cases. Since the death of Mock in 1958, similar cases had been occurring frequently, and all the victims had red bruises on their wrists. He found a pattern spanning several decades, but within the same time frame, all the cases revolved around the same person. For example, the first victim was the Great Witch. The reporter who wrote the article was the second. Then came the detective in charge of the case, the residents of Jiangjin Village, and so on. All these cases happened around Mock. Fast forward several decades, Sang's father took over the company. Shortly after taking office, he faced a large-scale investigation by the prosecutor's office on suspicion of illegal loans. Not long after, the prosecutor in charge of the investigation was found dead at home, followed by several more deaths, including its rivals. These cases revolved around Sang's father. Later, the focus of the cases shifted to Professor Gu. Recently, Professor Gu and other fraudsters have died, and the focus of the cases has turned to Young. Thus, Detective Senior decided to revisit the old case from 1958 and asked his partner to investigate the cases related to Sang's father of the trading company. At her grandmother's house, Young found records of her father's eye treatment. She found the ophthalmologist who treated him and learned that, beginning in 1999, her father suffered from a serious eye disease. He would suddenly go blind but recover quickly, just like what was happening to Young. Currently, there's no treatment for this disease, and the doctor believed that the patient would go blind within a few years. However, he ran into Professor Gu on the street last year, and he hadn't gone blind. The doctor used this to comfort Young, suggesting that there may still be hope. Young knew that her father had been possessed by the evil spirit. She guessed that her father might have chosen to compromise with the evil spirit to cure his eyes. It was both desperate and sad to know that Young might follow in her father's footsteps. Young began to squander the large inheritance left by her grandmother. She paid for her mother to take a coffee class, bought a car, and prepared a luxurious dinner to celebrate her friend's success in becoming a civil servant. Her friend was curious about why Young had changed so much at the dinner. Young openly admitted that she had been possessed by the evil spirit. Obviously, her friend didn't take her words seriously, and Young didn't expect her to believe her smelly bullshit either. The two joked and played until late at night. After her friend fell asleep, Young was heavy-hearted and sleepless. She faced her inner self and finally admitted that she wanted the evil spirit. The following day, Young awoke and found a photo of the ghost boy on the table. She began to search for the location of the portrait behind the boy. Despite visiting several temples, Young found nothing. Suddenly, the village chief of AKGWI contacted Young, asking her to come over. It turned out that Sang had learned from the old lady who made forbidden ropes that in order to seal the evil spirit, one must obtain 5 items and know the name of the evil spirit. Thus, Sang returned to AKGWI and tried to summon the spirit by rewriting the village's sacred pillar with his own blood. However, he fainted at the village entrance. Upon receiving the news, Young rushed to the village immediately. Sang was not in mortal danger, but he was like a walking corpse, staring blankly at the corner of the wall. A shadow was spreading from there into Sang's mind, echoing with a scene before his mother's death. After he opened the door, he saw the shadow of the evil spirit on the ground and looked up to find a person who looked exactly like him standing at the door. As Young entered the room, she saw the eerie shadow, but the other villagers were oblivious. Only Grandma Park could see it. She told Young that the shadow was a spirit of darkness. If a person is continuously mired in darkness and unable to extricate themselves, the shadow will gradually grow until they are swallowed by darkness. However, she did not know how to exorcise the spirit of darkness. As night fell, the shadow continued to spread, now occupying an entire wall. At this point, Young thought about how light is the opposite of darkness. She immediately took Sang in the car and drove east, for that is where ghosts and deities dare not tread. Sang fell into another illusion. He was lecturing in a classroom, but when he turned around, all the students were gone. The classroom was empty, except for a corpse covered with a blue cloth on the school desk. When he turned his head, the corpse suddenly appeared behind him. Sang ran wildly around the school building, with a corpse lying at the door of each classroom. He couldn't escape. Everything he saw filled him with terror. Young drove desperately towards the east, with the shadow following her. The streetlights behind the car extinguished one by one until the car could no longer move forward. Young and Sang abandoned the car and began to flee on foot. They stumbled and fell, unable to move forward with the shadow hot on their heels. Desperate, Young called out to Sang. At the critical moment, the sun began to rise in the east. Sang woke up and tightly grasped Young's hand. It turned out that Sang in the illusion also wanted to escape, but had no way to do so. It was not until he sensed Young holding his hand that he finally woke up. After escaping the spirit of darkness, Young showed Sang the photo of the ghost boy. Young suspected the spirit wanted her to find the temple in the photo. Sang was very surprised when he saw the photo. It should be at his old home, so why was the photo at Young's grandmother's house? Sang led Young to the temple shown in the photo and began to recall some past events with the boy. He had known long ago that the boy was possessed by a starving ghost, but he didn't dare to mention it for fear of losing his friend. One day, the boy stole a camera and was seen by the nanny. His eyes turned red and the nanny immediately had difficulty breathing. Luckily, Sang saw and stopped him in time. To help the boy out, Sang said he had asked the boy to fetch the camera. Then, Sang brought the boy to this temple to take photos, subtly implying that he was possessed by the starving ghost in the mural. Sang urged him to participate in the temple's rituals, but the boy didn't admit to being possessed. Not long after, the boy ran onto a highway and was killed in a car accident. Young and Sang found it strange that the evil spirit would lead them here. Then Sang noticed a poster advertising a life release ceremony. The ceremony was held at the reservoir behind the temple, and in the related cases of Professor Gu, one of the victims died in this reservoir. Sang recalled that Professor Gu wrote in his paper that the place where the evil spirit killed people would still have the victim's aura. If one seals items related to the evil spirit there, it can suppress the spirit. He guessed that items connected to the evil spirit might be buried near the reservoir. Young and Sang learned from a monk that last year Professor Gu donated a tree located near the reservoir. They found the tree and started digging, unearthing a bundle of rubber bands. The moment Young touched the rubber bands, fragmented images flashed through her mind. Now, the 5 items that Professor Gu sought, a red hairband, blue ceramic fragments, black rubber bands, a jade hairpin, and a glass bottle, the first 3 had been found. The next task was to search for the jade hairpin and glass bottle at the locations where the evil spirit killed people related to Professor Gu. What was certain was that both Professor Gu and Sang's mother had tried to bury these items to seal the evil spirit, but they were tragically killed by the spirit during the process. Young wondered why they failed, knowing the 5 items and the name of the evil spirit, Mok. They must have missed something. As she spoke, Young suddenly froze, her eyes unfocused. When she came to, she told Sang in terror that she saw someone else would die, this time in the Seoul police station. Not long ago, Sang had just talked to Detective Senior on the phone. The detective had gotten a new discovery from a friend who had examined documents from 1958 and invited Sang to the police station. Worried about Detective Senior, Sang and Young rushed there. On the way, Sang called the detective to remind him to stay in his office and not to open the door. Shortly after hanging up, Detective Junior entered, scaring the senior pale. He quickly reminded his partner to lock the door. Shortly after the door was locked, there came a hurried knock. They became tense. Sang's voice came from outside. Detective Junior opened the door, but it was not Sang outside. It was Young. Detective Senior clutched the case file. His body started to convulse. Detective Junior was puzzled. When he looked back at the door, Young had already disappeared. While Young and Sang were on their way, Young saw a vision of Detective Senior. Despite her best efforts, she arrived a step too late. Detective Junior struggled to accept the death of his partner. He questioned Young about her identity and why she disappeared from the office door in an instant. Young was also deep in sorrow, but she was soon possessed again. She coldly remarked, "It's just a death. Everyone dies eventually." Sang quickly pulled away the possessed Young, questioning why she didn't just kill him. Young replied that it was not his turn yet. The possessed Young passed a bar and was attracted by the bright lights. She spent the night there, returning home under the control of the evil spirit, and slept with her mother. The next day, she woke up to find herself possessed, with many hairpins brought back from last night. She even had a photo booth picture. Young couldn't help but question the evil spirit. How could it be in the mood for fun when someone just died because of her? She heard the voice of the evil spirit saying she needed him. After the death of his partner, a grieving Detective Junior mustered the strength to apply to become the host of the detective's funeral. After attending the funeral with a gloomy face, Sang moved into Detective Senior's house. Detective Junior came to find him, and they analyzed the current situation. They agreed that Detective Senior was murdered by a ghost. They believed the way to eliminate the ghost was to find 5 items related to the ghost and know its name. Sang remembered that Detective Senior had called him before falling from the building, saying that the information about Mock had been restored. Perhaps he knew the truth, which led to his death. Detective Junior found the document, which was a confirmation of Professor Gu receiving someone's belongings. Sang needed Young's help to figure out the mystery of Detective Senior's death. He went to his grandmother's house to find Young, who was in a trance, sitting on the floor with the furniture in the room overturned. Young found a full moon picture in the closet and a similar pattern under the chair. These were all drawn by Young under the control of the evil spirit. The conscious Young had lost the memory of this period. She told Sang that since finding the black rubber band, her memory gaps had been occurring more frequently. Sometimes she couldn't tell whether she was Young or the evil spirit. Young raised a question. The blue ceramic fragments and black rubber bands were all found by them under the evil spirit's guidance. From this perspective, could finding the 5 items really eliminate the evil spirit? Something didn't seem right to Young. Sang comforted Young and asked her what Detective Senior was doing before he died. Young recalled that she saw Detective Senior clutching a confirmation of receiving belongings, and the recipient was Professor Gu. Just as she was about to reveal this, the voice of the evil spirit rang in her ear, warning her that she would die if she told Sang. Left with no choice, Young chose to keep silent. In order to avoid putting Sang in danger, Young decided to act alone. After Sang left, Young pondered over a confirmation of belongings received by her father. Why would this be a weakness that the evil spirit wanted to conceal? She rummaged through her grandmother's house and found a box containing a camera and a bag from a local sanatorium. Inside the bag was a ledger from Jiangjin Village, with an IOU from the trading company tucked inside. The IOU was for a whopping 50 billion, dated June 7th. Young felt a familiarity with the date. After searching again in her father's study, she found some materials and finally discovered that June 7th was the day of Mock's disappearance. The ledger recorded the remuneration received by the relevant personnel in the village after handing over Mock. Young was still puzzled, wondering why her father had this ledger. Unable to figure it out, she took out the guest list from her father's funeral. Young found a person on the guest list and began to inquire about her father. This man ran a hotel where a forbidden rope made by Professor Gu was hung. He claimed not to know Professor Gu well, but the professor had stayed there a few times before. The hotel used to be a guest house, which was destroyed in a large fire decades ago. The man later bought the land and rebuilt it. Professor Gu had always been interested in this place and was the first guest after it was completed. Young learned that her father had also planted a tree here. The guest house owner remembered that shortly before Professor Gu's death, he came specifically for this tree. He braved heavy rain to dig out a box from under the tree which seemed to contain a red hairband. Professor Gu murmured to himself, wondering where it went wrong and why the evil spirit didn't disappear. After digging out the box, Professor Gu left distraught. He passed away a few days later. While Young was talking to the owner, Detective Junior had been trailing her and arrived at the place. His brow furrowed. This was the first case that Detective Senior was in charge of and where Sang's mother died. On the way back, Young was pondering while driving. Her father buried these things to seal the evil spirit, but why did he dig them out again? Suddenly, her vision went black. Young braked hard. When she came to, it was already night. She was in an unfamiliar place, struggling with Detective Junior. She had completely lost her memory of what had happened in the meantime. Young was panicked, fearing that the evil spirit would wreak havoc again. She realized that the evil spirit always came out at night when there was no sunlight. She immediately returned to her grandmother's house, hanging the forbidden rope on the walls of her room as a talisman, effectively imprisoning herself. Meanwhile, Sang discovered that among the several victims associated with Professor Gu, most of them had a direct connection with him. However, there was one person, a librarian, who seemed to have no connection at all. Sang managed to locate a colleague who had worked with the librarian. The colleague didn't find Sang's pursuit of the ghost absurd. Instead, she also mentioned the red bruise. The colleague recalled a strange incident when she and the librarian were working in a library that stored ancient documents. One day, the librarian suddenly went mad and started tearing up books as if she was being controlled. Not long after, she died mysteriously. The colleague managed to find the book that was being torn up. To Sang's surprise, the author of the book was the name of a victim in Jiangjin village. The author was an art teacher at Jiangjin Middle School who died by jumping from the school's rooftop. Sang was certain that this book also contained secrets the evil spirit wanted to hide. Sang tried to find the book, but to no avail. However, they did manage to get a graduation album from Jiangjin Middle School. Sang found a full moon pattern in the background, a pattern that also appeared on the wardrobe and chair at Young's grandma's house. Just then, Detective Junior came to find Sang. He told Sang that he had recently encountered the evil spirit. At that time, Detective Junior was following Young's car when he saw her suddenly brake. Young got out of the car and crossed the road without a care for the traffic. From her abnormal behavior, Detective Junior knew she had been possessed. The evil spirit asked Detective Junior for a ride to the amusement park. Once there, the spirit curiously looked around, fascinated by everything. Her doll accidentally fell to the ground when a passerby bumped into her. She was about to lose her temper, but Detective Junior picked it up for her. The spirit then suddenly asked the detective if he could like her. Sang and the detective analyzed that this evil spirit was adventurous, had mood swings, but was lacking love. They also observed when the spirit saw a child crying not far away, she purposely made the child let go of their balloon. The spirit said she hated children because they didn't know what they had and were noisy, which she found annoying. From this, Detective Junior deduced that the spirit had childlike characteristics but wasn't a child. She was somewhere between an adult and a child, likely a teenager. In any case, she couldn't be the 10-year-old Mock. At the same time, Young in her room also realized this problem. She searched for the lunar phase during the time of Mock's disappearance. There was no full moon from the time Mock was kidnapped to when she was killed. Therefore, Mock couldn't have seen the full moon and drawn a full moon pattern. As Young turned around, the disheveled spirit appeared outside her room. It's clear that this spirit was not Mock. Sang also came to this realization. He looked at the graduation album in his hand and understood why Professor Gu, despite finding 5 items and the name of the spirit, couldn't seal the spirit away. They both realized that they had been investigating in the wrong direction. Young was uncertain about her own future, but decided to fully commit to helping Sang dispel the evil spirit. She confessed to Sang that she could see visions whenever she touched an object related to the spirit, likely the spirit's memories. The first time she touched the red hairband, she saw a little girl sitting in front of a mirror. Touching the black rubber band next, she saw a woman hanging herself and an endless sea. The third time, when she touched the ceramic fragments from Sang's house, she saw someone being murdered in a warehouse. They still needed to find 2 more items. Once all 5 items were gathered, they could understand the spirit better. There were 2 more locations related to Professor Gu's incidents left to investigate: the apartment where the librarian jumped off the building and an abandoned building. The apartment was under reconstruction, so they decided to explore the abandoned building first. After a thorough search of the building, Young finally found a bottle tied with a rope hidden in the bathroom ceiling. The moment she grasped the bottle, her body froze. Sang stepped in and took the bottle from her. Suddenly, Young screamed out for water. She lowered her head slowly and, like a mad person, began searching the room for water. The abandoned building had no water supply, so Young ran to a nearby convenience store, broke the glass door of a freezer, and chugged down a bucket of water. Sang held Young back to stop her from drinking more water. The possessed Young began recounting her tragic past. She was wrapped in a blue cloth and everyone was waiting for her to die of hunger and thirst. But the spirit was resilient and begged for food and water. She endured for a whole week, and kidnappers only mocked her, asking why she wasn't dead yet. The spirit harbored hatred for the malicious people who kidnapped and killed her, but the spirit was no different, as she was also using Sang to gather the 5 items. The spirit was looking forward to Sang finding the last item. After all 5 items were gathered, whether the spirit would be sealed or something more terrifying would happen was unknown. After finishing her story, the spirit left the convenience store. Detective Junior called Sang. He had learned from the hospital that Sang's father also had a red bruise on his wrist before his death. Moreover, some terrifying things had happened at the hospital that year. Sang took out a recording that the detective had given him, a conversation with the hospital's director. He played it for the housekeeper. After a car accident in 1999 that hit the ghost boy, Sang's grandmother had moved the boy to the hospital. When the grandmother came to visit the boy, she learned that the boy was in a coma due to severe injuries. Enraged, she said the boy should be left to die, depending on the situation. She then went into the boy's room and closed the curtains. Shortly after, the grandmother left, and when the director entered the room, he found the boy had died. After listening to the recording, the housekeeper couldn't believe that the grandmother would kill her own son. Sang then revealed the truth. The ghost boy had been hiding in the study, and he overheard the grandmother sacrificing an innocent girl to establish her foundation. At the same time, he found out that Professor Gu had asked Sang's grandmother how to summon an evil spirit. Outraged, the grandmother gave Professor Gu a house as hush money, telling him not to inquire about the secret of the evil spirit anymore. When the two left, the boy rushed out of the room only to be seen by Sang's grandmother. To prevent her secret from being exposed, she was forced to kill even her own son. Upon hearing the truth, the housekeeper finally revealed that years ago, he had noticed that Sang's father always rushed home before sunset and stayed in, not going out at night. One evening, the housekeeper walked into the kitchen and discovered Sang's father sitting on the floor, eating food frantically as if possessed by an evil spirit. Sang's grandmother just watched her son, expressionless. From then on, the housekeeper frequently found Sang's father acting strangely. He would scribble on the floor and windows, and he would say harsh words to his beloved wife. When Sang's father regained his senses, he realized that the evil spirit wanted to kill his wife. So he went to his mother, wanting to get rid of the spirit's possession. However, Sang's grandmother was indifferent, stating that this was the price to be paid for the wealth the evil spirit brought to the family. Sang's father was tired of this life. He knew that years ago, a witch had told his mother that if they gathered 5 items and knew the spirit's name, they could eliminate the evil spirit. But if they made a single mistake, it would lead to fatal consequences. Seeing her son so determined, Sang's grandmother took out the method to eliminate the evil spirit from the safe and handed it to him. Ever since he found out how to eliminate the evil spirit, Sang's father started to refuse food and drink. Even when the hospital tried to nourish him with IV fluids, he would just yank out the needle. The housekeeper was heartbroken at the sight of Sang's father, trying to feed him water, but he was unable to swallow. What the housekeeper didn't know was that Sang's father was being suffocated by the evil spirit who was trampling on his wrists. In no time, Sang's father was starved to death, the evil spirit making him endure the same suffering it had before death. Detective Junior continued his investigation and discovered something strange. The night when Young was possessed, she was forced to arrange a meeting with an insurance planner and take out a large insurance policy for her mother. If her mother died, a hefty compensation would be received. It dawned on Young that the next target of the evil spirit was her own mother. Shattered, she started weeping. In her desperation, she urged Detective Junior to contact Sang. Young revealed that she had seen in the evil spirit's eyes the item that Detective Senior had grabbed before his death. There was a confirmation letter with a document in Chinese characters saying the family register. Sang suddenly realized that it was the family register of Mok that Detective Senior had obtained before he was murdered. Could it be that the evil spirit was actually a member of Mok's family? The spirit was worried that the family register would reveal its real name, so it killed Detective Senior. Sang speculated that the evil spirit could be Mok's older sister. Although the sister was a student at Jiangjin Middle School, the school had long been abandoned, and they had no way of knowing her name. Sang had to ask Young what she had seen when she obtained the fourth item, a glass bottle. She recalled seeing someone holding a glass bottle filled with red powder, standing at the entrance of Sang's house. Young's words did not provide any crucial clues, and everyone was still in the dark. Looking at the calendar, Sang noticed that the date in a few days was February 28th, the day of no defense, the only day in the year when the evil spirit couldn't appear. On this day, the evil spirit could not possess Young, and they could do something. On the eve of the day of no defense, the housekeeper brought Young to see Sang's grandmother. The grandmother glanced at the calendar, which read February 27th, and immediately relaxed. At that moment, Young was possessed by the evil spirit, and she warned Sang's grandmother that they would come here tomorrow to inquire about her name. The grandmother understood that Sang planned to deceive her on the day of no defense. She asked the evil spirit if it would kill Sang. The spirit asked if that would be a problem, and the grandmother replied that she had even killed her husband and son, and why she would hesitate now. The scene shifts back to 1979. Sang's grandfather felt that his wealth was enough, and he wanted to get rid of the evil spirit to enjoy his luxurious life. He smashed a wine glass at his wife, threatening her to hand over the contents of the safe to get rid of the evil spirit. Sang's grandmother angrily returned to her room. She hadn't summoned the evil spirit for this petty money. The evil spirit came forward wanting to help her get rid of her husband. They could switch the real name of the evil spirit in the safe, so anyone trying to eliminate or seal it would die tragically because they got the wrong name. Only the grandmother knew its real name. Back to the present, Sang's grandmother promised the possessed Young, uttering the spirit's name and saying that she would keep that promise. At this moment, Detective Junior checked his phone showing the date was actually February 28th, the day of no defense. It turned out they secretly coordinated with the housekeeper to replace the house calendar, creating the illusion that it was still February 27th, thus deceiving the grandmother. Once they got the spirit's name, Young revealed her identity, proving she was not possessed. The grandmother was shocked and, feeling betrayed, she overturned the table in a fit of rage. Seeing her in this state, the housekeeper had her admitted to the hospital for close monitoring. By now, they had discovered the evil spirit's name. She was Mock's older sister, named Lee. To seal the evil spirit, they needed to know the Chinese written characters of this name. Detective Junior prepared to look up the student register of Jiangjin Middle School. Young ran back to the grandmother's house, locked herself in, and set up the forbidden rope as a talisman. She sat quietly, waiting as minutes trickled by. Images started to flash in front of her eyes as the evil spirit began to take action. She saw the images related to Detective Junior, indicating that its next target was him. Detective Junior was investigating the Chinese name of Lee. He set off for Jiangjin Middle School. As it began to rain heavily, he suddenly heard someone knocking on his car window. It was Young. He intended to roll down the window, but noticed Young's fierce eyes. He hesitated, having seen those eyes before. They were the same as when Detective Senior died. They were the eyes of the evil spirit. At the same moment, his phone echoed with the evil spirit's roar, demanding him to open the door. When he turned his head, Young was gone from outside the window. He looked around anxiously but couldn't see Young, yet the violent knocking on the car door kept echoing. Simultaneously, Sang on the subway also heard strange knocking sounds, but he was the only one who could hear it. The subway train gradually approached the station, and Sang saw the possessed Young on the platform. To prevent Young from catching up with him, Sang hid in the next car and shut the door. The evil spirit seemed persistent, but when Sang turned around, it was gone. After escaping the evil spirit, Sang arrived at the construction site to find the fifth item, a jade hairpin tied with a rope. When he found the hairpin, it was broken and the other part was missing. Not long after, Detective Junior found Lee's life record book from the school, confirming the Chinese characters of her name. He met up with Sang. Now, they had discovered the evil spirit's name and the 5 items. Before the final sealing, they needed to confirm if the 5th item was genuine. They decided to find Young and have her touch the hairpin. Young, worried that she might harm the innocent, kept herself locked in the grandmother's house. The evil spirit, in an attempt to prevent Young from annihilating it, deliberately showed her some images. Young was shocked to learn that the spirit's next target was her mother. Young immediately untied the forbidden rope and returned home. At this moment, her mother was busy in the newly opened coffee shop. Suddenly, she received a call from the insurance company informing her that Young had purchased a life insurance policy for her, with Young as the beneficiary. She found this rather strange, but the realization hit her in an instant. The truth that Young had been possessed dawned on her. Frightened, she started to hyperventilate, red bruises appearing on her wrists. Her hands, seemingly out of control, picked up a rope and moved to hang it from a beam. Thankfully, Young arrived in time. Risking her own life, she commanded the evil spirit to stop, for if anything happened to Young, the evil spirit would have nowhere to go but to its doom. Under Young's threat, the evil spirit finally stopped. However, Young was once again possessed and silently left the shop. The possessed Young came before Sang's grandmother, who tried to negotiate with the evil spirit, attempting to forge a pact of mutual non-harm. Young untied one side of her bindings. Just as she breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the evil spirit had agreed to cooperate, she heard the spirit declare it would survive, but she would die. Upon hearing this, bruises began to appear on her wrist, and not long after, Sang's grandmother fell from the hospital building. By the time Detective Junior and Sang arrived at the coffee shop, Young had vanished. After sending her mother to the ambulance, the two split up. Detective Junior went to find Young, and Sang went to seal the items. They couldn't be sure yet if the hairpin was the last item, but the situation was urgent, and they had to take the risk. Sang requested the old lady to create another forbidden rope as a talisman. She reminded him to correctly identify the 5 items and the name of the evil spirit. Judging from Sang's hesitant expression, it was clear he wasn't entirely sure yet. Lee was the daughter of a poor fisherman, but the 5th item, the jade hairpin, was very expensive. Such an item would have been rare in a rural fishing village in that era. Meanwhile, Detective Junior arrived at the house but couldn't find Young. Unexpectedly, he received a call from an uncle who had attended Professor Gu's funeral. Previously, Young had contacted this uncle using the funeral guest list intending to visit, but he never showed up. Detective Junior decided to meet this uncle. In the uncle's house, Detective Junior noticed a full moon painting and found out that the author was the uncle's wife. The wife and Lee were both students in the art class at Jiangjin Middle School. Lee was poor and often dreamt of being born in a rich family. She had long coveted the paint jars displayed in shop windows, but she couldn't afford them. In Jiangjin in 1958, the Great Witch originally chose Lee for the sacrifice. Lee was delighted to receive the hairpin, oblivious to the fate that awaited her. When she overheard her parents talking, she learned that she was destined to starve to death and become a child ghost. Angered and scared, Lee couldn't accept this fate. When she saw her younger sister Mock also liked the hairpin and tried it on secretly, she had an evil thought. She gave the hairpin to Mock to replace her as the sacrifice. After Mock disappeared, their mother was inconsolable. Lee resented her mother for not caring about her predicament and only caring about Mock. Filled with resentment, Lee stole the money hidden in the family cabinet, exchanging it for the long-desired paint. But when she returned home with the paint, she found that her mother had chosen death. Lee was slapped by her father, who told her that her mother had been trying to save her all along, but she had betrayed her sister. Lee drowned in sorrow, numbing herself by doing housework. Her teacher came to her house, encouraged her to return to school, praised her talent, and even gave her a jar of paint. To Lee, who had always longed for her teacher's approval, this was a great encouragement. Just as Lee was about to pick herself up, she learned that her father and brother, who had gone out to sea to fish, had died in a shipwreck. Overwhelmed with grief and anger, Lee took the remaining money and went to the mansion behind the blue door, which was Sang's old house. Holding money, she found the Great Witch to plead with her to spare her sister. The Great Witch accepted the money and led her into a small room. Lee was ready to bring her sister home, but the Great Witch suddenly attacked her, pushing her under the blue cover as well, intending for her to become an evil spirit. The scene shifts to the present day where Sang returns to his hometown. He finds an old photo at home, and from this, he learns that the hairpin is not an artifact of the evil spirit. Its owner turns out to be the Great Witch. Detective Junior then comes to find Sang. Through a conversation with the painter, he finds out that Mock's body was returned to the village years ago, but Lee's body was never found. If the Great Witch killed Lee, her body would surely be hidden in a place that was easy to manage yet hard to discover. It could still be in this house. Sang remembers there's a place in the house that no one is allowed to enter, the small room where Mock and Lee were kept. Sang and the detective go to the small room and, after searching, they find a hidden door. After pushing open the door, they find a secret space. The detective notices something strange about the floor. They lift a section of the floor and find a skeleton hidden beneath. Among the bones, the detective finds the other half of the jade hairpin. Just as they make this discovery, Young calls, but the voice of the evil spirit starts to echo in her ears again. The spirit, free from worldly desires, enjoys Young's company and wants to stay with her. Young feels someone embracing her from behind. It's Lee. Young rejects her, asking her to return where she belongs. Disappointed, Lee releases her grip on Young. Now that her name is known, she is destined to disappear, but she has one last request: to find her body back. Young tells Sang about the evil spirit's request, but she doesn't want him to find the body. The evil spirit has been using them from the beginning to find these items. Young doesn't know what will happen once they find the body. Sang, holding the half-jade hairpin, realizes that the evil spirit led them here, possibly for this half-hairpin, but they still don't know the spirit's real motive. The scene then flashes back to 1958 when Lee was trapped here but not yet dead. She took advantage of the Great Witch's inattention to knock her down, pulled out the witch's hairpin, and fiercely stabbed it into her chest. In the struggle, the hairpin broke in two. The witch fought back and killed Lee with a knife. Lee was covered with the blue cloth. Before she closed her eyes, she tightly held the half-hairpin in her hand. At the moment, Young discovered that her shadow no longer appeared disheveled. It seemed as if she had transformed into a different person, wearing a wicked expression. She mumbled to herself that it was over. Sang and Detective Junior found Young, and they were surprised to see that her shadow had returned to normal. The detective handed the jade hairpin to Young. When she touched the hairpin, she didn't see anything, which left everyone puzzled. Young recalled the phone call she had made to Sang, telling him not to search for the body. The moment she hung up, she lost her memory. When she regained consciousness, she found her shadow had returned to normal. The two were baffled by Young's change, and they could only observe and wait for now. At that time, Sang received news of his grandmother's death. He went to the morgue and found red bruise marks on his grandmother's wrist. The police found that a young woman had visited the ward before his grandmother's death. Sang knew it must have been Young, possessed by the evil spirit, who might still be lingering nearby. Sang didn't know the true purpose of the evil spirit. All he could do was proceed with their original plan to seal the 5 items one by one. On the other hand, Young and her mother returned to their peaceful life. However, her mother was always on edge. She found out that Young had collected all the family photos of the mother and daughter. This made her even more vigilant towards Young. Young explained that she just wanted to leave behind the painful past and start a new life with her mother. She even planned to study art. This shocked her mother, who asked if Young planned to paint a full moon picture. It turns out that years before, Professor Gu had also painted a full moon picture at home before his death. Upon hearing this, Young's eyes suddenly changed. She wasn't Young, but the evil spirit. Crying and shouting, Young tried to explain, but no matter what she said, her mother didn't believe that she was Young. It turns out the evil spirit had planned to pretend to be Young and live with her mother, but when her cover was blown, the evil spirit grew furious. Later, Young suddenly woke up. Seeing that she was running late for work, she said goodbye to her mother and prepared to leave, but she didn't hear any response. When Young went to check the room, she saw a full moon picture on the wall and ceramic shards placed on the bedside. She saw a disheveled figure picking up the shards and charging at her. Terrified, Young scrambled out of the house. She looked up at the sky and saw a weird full moon hanging in the air. Everything in her sight had turned green. With the figure chasing her, she was forced to run in panic. In the real world, Young aimlessly wandered about, with Detective Junior following closely in his car. He didn't understand what Young was up to as she visited a jewelry store, a flower shop, and an auto repair shop. It suddenly dawned on him that Young had been visiting these places for all deadly poisons capable of taking lives. Detective Junior was puzzled by the evil spirit's sudden change in its murder method, opting to poison people. The evil spirit didn't answer, but mentioned that no matter how hard Detective Junior tried, he wouldn't be able to save Young. Meanwhile, Sang was traveling to various places to seal the items. When he arrived at Young's house, Young's mother suddenly rushed out with a knife, stabbing him. However, she couldn't bring herself to finish the job and started crying, shouting that she couldn't do it. Not long ago, she discovered that Young's body had been possessed by the evil spirit, who told her that her daughter was trapped in a mirror, under torture. If she wanted to save Young, she had to kill Sang. Hearing this, Sang realized that originally the evil spirit was in the mirror, and Young was in the real world. So Young's shadow had always been the disheveled image of the evil spirit. Now that they had switched places, Young's shadow had returned to its normal state. The evil spirit had been using Sang all along to find its body and the final item, perhaps to complete the exchange ceremony between the mirror and reality. The 5 items and the evil spirit's name were originally the means to seal the shadow, but now that Young had become the shadow, if Sang continued, Young might end up being the one sealed. It seemed impossible to eliminate the wicked ghost under these circumstances. However, Detective Junior discovered that Sang's grandmother had severe tearing wounds on her fingers just before her death, seen on surveillance footage. She had deliberately inflicted these wounds with her last bit of strength, seemingly to convey a message. This reminded Sang of the news about the finger of Mok, which had been treated as the divine body of the child ghost. Sang remembered that Mok's finger was found in the shrine of the Great Witch. Sang suddenly understood that his grandmother was hinting at him to find Lee's finger. Sang returned to his grandmother's house. The police had not found the finger where Lee's body was discovered, so if it wasn't there, Sang guessed it might still be at his house. They began searching the house, but found no trace of the finger. Just when they were at a loss, Detective Junior received a text message from Young's mother saying that Lee wanted to kill her. Earlier, Young's mother had returned home and told the evil spirit that Sang was looking for her finger. The mother willingly betrayed Sang, hoping this would win back Young, but the evil spirit ignored her pleas. The spirit poured a glass of juice for the mother to drink. The mother noticed the antifreeze in the sink and realized something was wrong with the juice. After drinking the juice, she collapsed. The evil spirit used the mother's phone to send a message to Detective Junior. Seeing the message, Detective Junior and Sang rushed to Young's house. This was a trick used by the evil spirit to divert their attention. Just as the two left, the evil spirit arrived at Sang's grandmother's house. Back in 1958, the Great Witch had killed Lee and approached Sang's young grandmother. She handed over a paper containing the 5 items needed to eliminate the evil spirit and Lee's name, along with a wooden box containing Lee's finger. The Great Witch warned the grandmother that this ghost was different, very resilient, and might possess someone else. She advised the grandmother to keep the wooden box where it could be seen, and to destroy the divine body if possession occurred, thus eliminating the evil spirit. After much contemplation, the grandmother hid the box behind a painting in the hall on the first floor. The grandfather, already possessed at that time, saw this. After many years, the evil spirit returned to the grandmother's house and retrieved the box from behind the painting. Just then, Sang's voice came from behind. Sang locked the door, leaving himself alone in the house with the evil spirit, who was surprised that Sang had seen through her plan. Originally, Sang and Detective Junior were on their way to Young's house, but just as he was about to get in the car, Sang noticed something was off. He had never mentioned the evil spirit's name to Young's mother, so how could she accurately say the name Lee? It was clear that the message was sent by the evil spirit to distract them. Sang stayed in the house waiting for the wicked ghost, while Detective Junior went to Young's house and took her poisoned mother to the hospital. Seeing Sang trying to take the finger, the evil spirit Lee begged for mercy, saying that she desperately wanted to live, but Young was always depressed and even harbored harmful thoughts. The spirit argued that she should be given the chance to live and that she would cherish every day. Undeterred, Sang moved forward to take the finger. It was Young's life, and he had no right to make any decisions for her. Seeing the finger taken by Sang and doused in gasoline, the evil spirit picked up a glass bottle beside her and hurt Young's body. Sang stopped the spirit's actions, put away his lighter, and placed the wooden box and the lighter on the ground. The possessed Young took the opportunity to scratch Sang's forehead and stab his abdomen, getting the wooden box. As the spirit prepared to leave, she found herself unable to move. Her hand suddenly lost control, and the panicked spirit looked around to see Young's figure appearing in the mirror. During her time in the mirror, Young was chased every day by a disheveled woman who wanted to kill her. Young was strangled and couldn't breathe. In her struggle, she pushed the woman's hair aside, only to find out that the disheveled woman was herself. All of her past experiences flashed before her eyes. Young had always worked hard to survive, working outside every day at an age when she should have been playing. Young had also complained about life. She never lived for herself and wished to end her miserable life. Understanding this, Young's will to live grew stronger. She wanted to live for herself. With her firm will, Young overcame her dark self. Having controlled the spirit, Young picked up the lighter from the ground, lit the wooden box containing the finger. As a result, the evil spirit disappeared into thin air, and Young returned to her own body. Afterwards, Young managed a coffee shop with her mother and used her free time to work through her bucket list. She experienced the thrill of a high-altitude zip line, went on camping trips with her mother and best friends to stargaze, and truly began to enjoy her life. Young didn't tell her mother that she had inherited the same eye disease as her father, Professor Gu. She wouldn't go blind immediately. She should be able to maintain her sight for 5 to 6 years, or possibly just 1 to 2 years at worst. As for Sang, he continued to work as a university professor. After his grandmother's passing, he chose to donate all the family wealth to society. One day, there was a local cultural event intended to drive away diseases and evil influences. It was a large purification ceremony designed to guide lost spirits towards the blissful afterlife. Sang purposely took Young to attend this grand ceremony. Despite the evil spirit being driven away, Young could still see spirits. She noticed that the spirits here all seemed content and happy. Through the positive implications of the event, Sang hoped that Young could also live a happy life. Young watched the ceremony before her eyes, determined to live her life to the fullest, even if she would gradually lose her sight until total blindness. She wanted to live each day with a smile, embracing happiness throughout. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.